Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the concern from a lot of Conservative MPs about the threat posed by Reform UK, how worried they should really be, and what, if anything, they can do about it. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, please subscribe to the channel. So, at the next election, the Conservatives face a fresh challenge. They're going to be squeezed at the centre and the far right by Labour and Reform UK, respectively. Now, you might argue that was true in 2015 with UKIP and 2019 with the Brexit Party. However, it wasn't quite the same. In both 2015 and 2019, Labour were presenting a relatively poor challenge, and in 2019, the Brexit Party did not stand candidates in existing Conservative seats. Reform UK is claiming that it's going to stand candidates in every seat in Britain, that is England, Wales and Scotland. If true, then this will be new for the Tories. A Labour Party that has recaptured the centre ground and a moderately appealing party gathering votes on the far right. Conservative MPs are worried. Now, I've already said I think they're failing to get things into perspective, as they seem far more worried about Reform UK than they do Labour, but I think that can be explained by the fact that there's a lot of very influential Conservative MPs who, if push comes to shove, would rather the Conservative Party were much more like Reform UK, and there's not really many of them wishing they were more like Labour. So I think that's why that is. But that being said, it is right that they should be concerned by Reform UK, but how worried should they be? Well, it's difficult to know exactly, because so far Reform UK appear to have selected just 20 candidates to stand. Now, there are a lot of candidates to be selected by the various mainstream parties. None of them have got their full suite lined up yet. But they're going to have to get a move on if the election is called sooner rather than later. But, 20 candidates out of over 600, that is a very, very, very far behind, isn't it? Reform UK doesn't have the infrastructure that other parties do. It doesn't even have proper memberships, let alone proper constituency party bureaucracy. If it's going to stand candidates in every seat in England, Wales and Scotland, I would query why they're not making more progress on selecting candidates. I know we sometimes joke about some seats being safe enough for some parties to stick the right coloured rosette on a donkey and they would win. But Reform UK run the very real risk of actually needing farm animals as their candidates if they have to rush at the last minute. So, although I am prepared to believe that they might follow through on their boast this time, I'm not really seeing signs of them seriously preparing to do so. That being said, some of their really small number of candidates so far are being selected for existing Conservative seats. I would definitely smell a rat if it was only in Labour seats. So they are at least giving the impression that they will stand against the Tories in at least some parts of the country. And wherever they do stand, they will take away more votes from the Conservatives than from Labour. When the results came out for the by-elections last week, Reform UK gained more votes than the difference between Labour and the Conservatives in both cases. Now, Reform UK, of course, claimed that they made the difference, right? Now, in reality, that's not true. Not everyone who voted for Reform UK would have voted Conservative if they'd stood aside. Some would have voted for, one of the gammon parties like UKIP, or maybe an independent with some policies, or maybe just a different party. Some may not have voted at all. So no, it wouldn't have actually made the difference, but it is reasonable to suppose that a significant percentage, maybe even a large percentage of those Reform UK votes are likely to have gone to the Conservatives had the Reform UK candidate not stood. In terms of what the Conservatives can do about Reform UK, I'd make the following point. The Tories are currently making very little effort to counter Labour's offer, and yet not only is this easier to do, but Labour are taking more votes from them. The Tories will always have an easier time countering Labour than Reform UK, because Labour are presenting policies which they fully intend to deliver. So there has to be details there. They have to be realistic and credible, which are not always the same thing. Reform UK, on the other hand, can come up with the maddest schemes imaginable because they know they'll never be called upon to implement them. Also, if any expert decides to take the trouble to point out how Reform UK's policies are utterly insane, Tice will just call them tofu-eating Ramona woke blob monsters and carry on talking nonsense. How do the Tories counter that? The more the Tories try to lean into the culture wars with policies designed to appeal to the fringe gammon, the more Reform UK will just move their own offers to be even more extreme. And Reform UK have the advantage of being able to point out that the Conservatives are in power right now. Never mind promising policies, they could implement them right now. So why aren't they? Now, trying to take Reform UK on in like a policy battle doesn't seem a sensible strategy. It involves moving away from the large groups of swing voters who will actually determine the election in order to appeal to a very niche group who will mostly vote for the craziest option. Where they might have need to focus more on their efforts would be what arrangement can they make with Reform UK? You know, like they did in 2019, to get them to stand down in certain seats. For this, you'd have to understand what Reform UK actually want to achieve. Now, as I see it, we don't know for certain, I don't know for certain, but there are a couple of possibilities. The first is that they actually want to establish themselves as a genuine political party, but of course that would require changing the electoral system. They're not going to win seats as they are. Might actually mean those of us in favour of PR get ourselves some rather uncomfortable allies. Or second, to act as a stick, an external stick, to keep the Tories focused on their right flank, quashing moderate policies. Could be based on the notion that Labour can't stay in power forever, and if they can just maintain a measure of control over Tory leaderships, then when it's time to challenge Labour again, they stand aside in return for certain policy commitments. Now, whichever Reform UK wants, they won't help themselves by standing aside for the Conservatives at the next election for two reasons. First, it's doubtful that anyone will take them seriously again. They stood aside in 2019. If they do it again in 2024, they will upset supporters and struggle to ever convince anyone that they're serious in the future. They'll just be seen as a protest magnet in by-elections. Second, there'd be no point, because in 2019, the Brexit Party were actually kingmakers. If they had stood candidates in Tory seats, the Conservatives would not have won that majority. You know, in fact, you know, they might have lost even more seats than they even had at the time, which was already a minority. But in 2024, the Conservatives are going to lose, whether or not Reform UK stand. What Reform UK want to do is persuade the Conservatives that they can make the difference between winning and losing. So standing aside at the next election won't do that, because the Tories will still lose and still lose heavily. Best to stand, at least in strategically prime seats, because I don't believe they'll do it in all of them, in order to cost the Tories more seats than they would otherwise lose. That way, when the conditions are different and a future general election looks closer, Reform UK can cut a deal. If they want to exist to keep the Tories focused on gammon-friendly policies, that is. And if they do want to become a serious political party, well, they can keep pushing for the electoral reform, which will help them win seats. But I remain sceptical that they want to become a serious party. Like, the party's got 3 members. You think to yourself, well, there's loads of people paying like subs and stuff like that. Yeah, they're just contributors. They don't have any membership rights. They've got fewer rights within that organisation than people joining a single interest lobby group. If they had a long-term aim of becoming a serious political party, wouldn't they be building the bureaucracy up? I think it's more likely that they're just a Tory lobby group disguised as a political party. I think they want to replicate the influence that UKIP had in 2015, only on a broader range of policies and over a longer period of time, which would give the Tories a way of coming to agreement with them. Unfortunately, that agreement means keeping the Conservative Party more distant from the majority of swing voters. Now, for my money, if the Tories want to counter the threat from Reform UK, they'd have been better off just making some things work. After all, what would Reform UK have to campaign on if the people they attract were sort of getting on all right? Reform UK appeal to people who've essentially been persuaded that the problems in their lives are not caused by wealthy arseholes, but immigrants. But what if there were no major problems in their lives? That's the way to deal with Reform UK. It would also be the way to deal with any political opponents. If you just sort of make things work when you're in government and people can see that, then you diminish an awful lot of opposition. And one advantage the Tories always have is that the media will largely back them up. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.